everybody. We are back. We decided to switch things up a little bit this time, and instead of doing a pajama chat webinar, we kind of wanted to do a roundtable discussion. It's a very interesting time here in Boston. Black Lives Matter protests have been happening and sports have been on hold, but what we've seen is that a lot of the athletes are stepping up and being more visible in activism. And we wanted to kind of talk about that and talk about it from the people that are covering it. So we put together this amazing panel, right, Jess, of it's all girls, because
girl power.
That's it. Listen, anybody who has a problem with that, they can send me an email and I'm sure I'll respond politely. But it's amazing, amazing girls that when we kind of went looking about to who to talk to, these were girls that we have pitched before, right?
Yep. Yeah, we worked with all of them for the most part.
Yeah, I think there was only Robyn from the Celtics is new, and I can't wait to get to know her more. But we really put together a bunch of women who cover these teams, cover these athletes, and have been doing such an amazing job of covering how these teams, these athletes are dealing with everything happening today. So we thought instead of doing a webinar, we would kind of introduce this RingComm Roundtable discussion series where we get people together to talk about some of these issues from a bunch of different perspectives. So today it's going to be the perspective of the media because they're the ones that are telling the stories.
Yep.
So without further ado, we will bring in our girls and get the discussion going. You ready, Jess?
I'm so ready.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so why don't we, we'll just do like a quick intro and then Jess, I'll pass it over. And do you want to do the intros of the girls? And then I'll kick it off to the first question.
Sure. So I'll just go through the list in alphabetical order because it's easiest. We'll start with Courtney Cox from NESN. Say hey.
Hey.
Meredith Gorman, also from NESN. Kwani and Lunis from NBC 10 Boston, new job alert, which is awesome. Robyn Neal from the Boston Celtics. Nora Princiotti from The Ringer. Nicole Yang from Boston Globe. And Michaela Vernava from NESN.
Say hey, girls.
Hey.
So I'm so excited, one, because I like literally haven't seen so many of your faces in so long, and I, you know, I look forward to bombshells every year because it's like the one time I get to like get all of you girls together. But you know, with all the social distancing and things being canceled, so I want you guys to know that Jess and I totally appreciate you guys spending time to do this today. We thought that it's an important conversation to have. And you guys have been, I mean, we've been following everything that you guys have been putting out with all the teams trying to figure out whether to come back and all the activism that's going on. So your perspectives are going to be huge. And also, you know, thank you to the, you know, peanut butter to my jelly, Jess, for sticking out this tough time. But we thought it was important right now because I mean, we've been in crisis since March. You know, we've all been locked in our houses. There's been no sports going on. There's been so much happening in the world. And we thought it would be a really, really good time to kind of talk about the role that sports plays. And who better than you guys? So we'll start kind of with the first question. And I'd love to hear just your thoughts, your experiences, if you have stories, because I know, like Kwani, you've been, you know, out there, you know, recently kind of covering a lot of stuff. So any kind of, you know, personal anecdotes or things that you've seen would be great. And obviously we're going to start with the most important one. And that is, why do you guys think that sports, athletes, teams, they play such an important role in times of crisis, but also in times of kind of societal, you know, issues going on? And we'll do it alphabetically. So Courtney, we'll start with you.
So for me, it's such a difficult question because I think we're so in it right now. So when I'm covering a story, I'm so laser focused on that. And it's important that because I think a lot of times you forget that people are actually watching what you're doing. And when it comes to why sports play such a big role in times like this, I don't have siblings, I don't have younger siblings, but I have younger cousins, and I feel like every time I'm home with them, it's a holiday, it's dinner, all they're talking about is, did you see what Jason Tatum posted? Did you see what Tom Brady said? They're constantly talking about stuff like that. And right now, it's important that everyone's focused on the future and how we're going to make change in the future. And I know this sounds cliche, but everybody says it starts at home. Children are our future. So I think it goes to the youth, because they're watching what all of these athletes are saying and doing. And they're seeing what athletes are being praised for, making sure that their voices are being heard, but they're also seeing them be held accountable for things that they've said right now and in the past. I think Drew Brees was an important, example of that, where people saw that he said something in a moment, and then now he's backtracking and he's trying to figure out the best way to go forward there. But to see guys like Jaylen Brown out there in the protests, and how people are looking up to these guys and ladies who are making sure that their voices are heard, and they're seeing it's cool to speak up and speak out against any type of racial injustice. And so that's where I've seen the athletes and the teams play such an important role. And even the school athletics. I went to BC, and their initial statement wasn't great that they posted as a school. They were missing 3 major words that were the most important thing. They tiptoed, they danced around what they were trying to say. And they came back and they released a new statement. But it took a lot of people speaking out for them to do so. And for the youth to see that, and to see how schools, teams, athletes are responding, that's what's going to make a change at home, because they're being better educated. And I know I am as well. I'm a white woman in sports, and I'm not perfect. I'm going to make, mistakes going forward. I'm sure I have in the past. And so learning during this time, and I'm learning a lot from these guys that we cover every day on a court, on a field, on ice, but now I'm learning from them off. Mm-hmm. So kind of a roundabout way of going about it. And I think you can probably tell I'm nervous. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend anyone. So I think that's why it's so important right now. And I think that's why so many people are listening and taking a step back, and it starts with the youth. So roundabout way of saying it, but I think that's why it's so important.
No, that's perfect. And I actually, so Meredith, you're next. And if I remember correctly, you covered when Kraft sent the plane to get the masks, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I did it. Why? And so now we're going from, what everything that's been happening, that's still, sometimes we forget that played a role in the COVID crisis too. Like a lot of these athletes and teams, had to go back even to the early parts of that. Like, why was that such like a big thing for us? Like, why did everybody be like, yeah, the Patriots truck is like, what does that do for us?
Well, I think sports in general, sports is such a great unifier of people. In Boston, we've seen it so many times, the Boston Marathon, after every Super Bowl win that the Patriots had. It brings people together. And I think in times of crisis, not only it, in ways a good distraction to watch a game when there's hard things going on, but you just see how people come together, and it doesn't matter, what their race is, what these, underlying factors are. You see people come together for, one common thing. And, that's like they love to watch a game played, but then you also see how things are so much bigger than just a sports team, bigger than just a game. And it's when these teams use their resources and their platform to extend beyond just, the sports aspect. And I think we saw that with what the Crafts did, and the Crafts have done so much more than that, beyond just that during the COVID period. Just in normal life, they're constantly giving back to the community. And I think that's to be said for all of the sports teams in this area. But I just think being able to utilize the platform that you do, and the fan base and the group of people that you have paying attention to you all the time can really bring important issues to light and make people more aware of things because that built-in platform already, and just like the unifying factor.
Yeah. Kwani, let's bring it over to you too, because you're also, and I don't know where everybody went to college, but I do know Kwani also is a BC grad. And so now you have covered multiple, you've moved from kind of covering one team, you kind of cover all of them. So what have you, like, what is your thought? Because you're seeing how all these different sports, I mean, you've even covered UFC for me before. Right. Like, what have you felt that sports is doing for all of us and everything that's been happening since March in these have been some crazy months. So what role have they played? Has it all been good? Has it all been bad? What do you think?
Right. I mean, looking at the Boston, I mean, we're in Boston, obviously, and just looking at the climate here, the protests that have been going on, but also the fact that Courtney mentioned it, we've had our star players on the front lines of most of these protests. I think it kind of just speaks to the fact that people always wanted to have this stick to basketball or shut up and dribble mentality. But now we're seeing players like Jaylen Brown. You're looking at even Kyrie, even though it's controversial with Brooklyn, the way that he wants to step up for Black lives. And they're realizing that, yes, they're basketball players. I mean, they're not realizing this. I think people are realizing that they're more than just basketball players. At the end of the day, I've always made this analogy. If a Jaylen Brown were to get pulled over and he happened to not be in Boston where most of the fans would know who he is, he's just another Black man in America. And I think now we're realizing with the climate of our country that this is more than just basketball. Obviously, we love sports. We love to watch it, to decompress. But at the end of the day, these athletes are just like us as Black human beings. And so I think them having that platform is beneficial, though, because when you have a player on the front line of this and saying, hey, this is a personal experience to me, all the people that looked up to them, it'll be divisive. I think there will be people that are like, oh, I just want my athletes to shut up and play basketball. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have people that may not even have thought of it before, and they admire this specific player so much.
I had taken no part in the statement that was put out. That was way above me. But once it was put out, I know a lot of people felt the same way. A lot of you felt that there were words that were missing. There were things that we probably should have said. And it wasn't until a lot of us started speaking up and they started seeing the players take part in it and being on the front lines that they felt like it was their responsibility. Now we have to do something. That should have never been the case. If it mattered to you and your players mattered to you when your roster is 90% minority and a lot of them are African American, you should have said something in the first place if these are the people that you care about. But that's just my perspective on it. I think.
But that's an interesting perspective because you're right. I think the players all over the country have been driving a lot of the action on this. And Nora, now you're over on the national side. You know, you were Boston side, but now you're covering from an NFL national perspective, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same because a lot of them are, you know, now are the same thing is kind of happening. So is it important, and what kind of role have from your perspective, have the athletes and the teams, and is it the same? Are the athletes driving the teams in the NFL as well? Just like Robyn said, they were doing it for the NBA.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think that the thing that, you know, the elephant in the room or whatever you want to call it is that these are businesses that ultimately care about their money. And so it does not necessarily make them very effective leaders, but it makes them very effective cultural weather vanes, kind of. So when we see Roger Goodell respond to an edict from a bunch of his most high-profile players saying, we need to hear you say Black Lives Matter, and we need to hear you say that you were wrong for not encouraging peaceful protest all these years, and to see him do it quickly without presumably the time to consult every individual owner, you know, every single one of his 32 bosses, you know that there is an underlying shift in that says the thinking has changed about what's going to be acceptable to the American people who watch football. And I think going back to just why sports has been so important in this time or in other times of crisis overall, I know something I was thinking about a lot when the coronavirus shutdown started here, and we were all just spending so much more time than usual in our homes, was kind of why I fell in love with sports when I was a little kid, because I like Courtney, only child vibes here. We moved a decent amount, and it was this way, by following sports teams and players that I loved, that my parents and I could bring more people into our house. And I'm a really social person who spent a lot of either one-on-one or two-on-one time with my family as a kid. And that was how we had other characters just sort of part of the ecosystem. And I think that's what, on a larger scale, sports does for our country, because it's kind of the last remaining element of monoculture. Like, we started this conversation talking about, I think it was before other people could maybe join us and see this, but we were talking about what TV shows we've been watching. And we all had 90 different answers, because you can have Hulu, you can have Netflix, you can watch, regular television or whatever. And streaming music allows people to listen to exactly what they want. And there are so few remaining parts of popular culture that appeal really, really, really broadly. And sports is what does that still in America, and I think in the world. And so, to bring it back to the protests and what we're talking about in terms of pervasive racial injustice in this country, it becomes a really effective vector for that conversation as well, because not only are we seeing the ways that so many athletes are taking a stand and being leaders, people can't hide from it. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but there are a lot of fans of teams, there are a lot of fans of anything, there are a lot of people who need to hear these messages and don't necessarily believe them. But for better or for worse, presenting that population with, well, if you don't want to hear about it, that means you have to turn off football on Sundays, is a really, really powerful tool. So the fact that when we couldn't have sports, how much we missed it, to me, is kind of interesting in conversation with this idea about how sports leagues and teams and players can be leaders, really in anything, because people listen to their voices really clearly, and we don't want to have to turn it off. And again, that can be used. And I think we're seeing players more and more empowered to do that. But it does, from what I've witnessed, it starts with the players, because the teams and then the leagues especially are, I think, always going to be a step slow, because they're thinking about, their bottom lines.
Right.
And that's tough to change.
Nicole, you've covered recently the Red Sox coming out with their statement and all the stories, right?
Yeah.
And that's very uncommon as well. Like, the Red Sox are usually like tight-lipped, they say nothing. And yet Red Sox has this very unique kind of fan base where we're more fans of baseball than we are sometimes of the team. So what do you think that kind of role has been like for, playing into all of this? Everything too, from the COVID crisis to this, but what have you seen?
I mean, I think the Red Sox, just acknowledging the first line of their statement was, "This is real." And I think that was a good message to a lot of fans who might try and continue to deny that these injustices are happening in our city. I think there's a sense that we know these athletes because of how often we see them. There are 162 baseball games per year. There are 82 NBA games. There's social media. We're constantly being inundated with coverage of them. So there's a sense that you know them, but in actuality, most of us don't know them. And so when you start to learn more about them and their experiences and like what life is like as them, if that doesn't really fit into your image of them, it sort of makes fans uncomfortable and they sort of just push it away, I think. So I feel like athletes are a vehicle to sort of bring up these issues and sort of educate fans like, no, this is a real experience. Like, this isn't just some like nebulous topic. Like, this is our everyday life. And so I think it's important for both athletes to communicate their experience, but then also for organizations to just acknowledge and confirm like, this is real, this is happening. And that way fans can sort of see like it's not just about the sports, it's about sort of everything else that comes with just being like a human.
Yeah. Michaela, I always gonna go to you because you cover so much of the UFC stuff, and you've covered how many of the fighters were doing this all over the world. I would not have known that half of the fighters were doing this in New Zealand and countries like this. So it goes beyond, right? You're covering this happening all over the world, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, a lot of just what everyone's said already, starting with what Courtney said about being able to reach youth. I think that athletes are really some of the most influential people out there because they are celebrities, but then you also, it's almost like on a more local basis. So obviously a lot of kids look up to athletes. So you see, I mean, John Jones has been a guy, a UFC fighter that has been out in the streets. And I think that in the past, he's certainly had his ups and downs and not always been a shining example of being a role model. But when it's come to what's going on lately, I think that he has been an unbelievable example of, he's out there with groups of people. His messages have been great. He's leading by example. What I'm finding really fascinating right now, I think that, I mean, obviously we're in an absolutely unprecedented time. And when I think about in the past tragedies that have happened between 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing are good examples where you saw all the sports teams rally, or all cities rather, rally around the Yankees. Or when in 2013, I remember like the Chicago Tribune published a cover that said, it like had their own team names crossed out and was like, we are the Chicago Bruins, the Chicago Celtics. And it just, sports is always such a powerful thing that brings people together in times of crisis, and in a way is an escape from the pain that people are feeling, in a way to support one another. So what's really odd about the COVID situation is that when all this started to go down, and it's obviously been for so many people a very tragic time, for others that haven't been directly affected, we're just confined to being inside, but the range of pain that's being experienced right now is vast. And to have sports completely shut down is something we've never experienced before, where something on such a big scale is going on and we don't have sports to watch and to lean on. And then that coincides with what's going on right now in terms of the protests over racial injustice. And frankly, I mean, it's just odd to me because I think that this topic is something that is far overdue to have this many eyes on it. It's something that it's been talked about for decades, and it's shocking to me that it's taken this long for the whole world to really, all eyes are on it. So I do wonder, is what part of sports and basically everything being shut down, is that what it's taken for everyone to finally pay attention to these issues? And then right now, when you hear some of the NBA players' concerns about restarting and it becoming a distraction, it's just a very, I don't know what everyone else's opinions are on that, because I myself am like I don't know. On one hand, I'm like, having the floor and more eyes on the NBA does that bring their platform to light more? Or does restarting sports take away from the fact that most stuff is shut down right now, so all eyes are on the protests and the movement right now?
That's interesting. So before I let Jess take the next question, I didn't even think of that. Is that something that you guys are all seeing? Is that there's people that fear, and you guys can jump in, like I said, I'll record this, but that if sports wasn't going on, or if sports comes back, we're going to lose focus of what's important. Is that a fear across all the different teams, sports, athletes, things like that? Anybody can jump in.
I think so, because when you look at the climate of the protests, they started because, not mainly because, but obviously the death of George Floyd, but I think a big part of it was the fact that everyone was stuck at home. Mm-hmm. And I actually talked to a former city councilor who said this, and when he said it, it made a lot of sense. Like, people had been stuck at home for months, bored, didn't have much to do. And that's not to say that, I don't think that discredits the protest, but I think it is what drove more passion behind it, because we're like, we have nothing to lose. Like, people were out in the streets because they had nowhere to go, and they really wanted to be vocal about this. And I think with sports coming back, it will be interesting, because to Michaela's point, to have the platform a few years ago when they wore the I Can't Breathe shirts, that in the NBA, that actually caused a lot of controversy. Obviously with Colin Kaepernick kneeling, that still causes a lot of controversy. So I do understand having that national platform for people to see you do what they, play the sport that they know you for and are committed to watching you do, but then eventually realizing like, oh, they're gonna talk to me about Black Lives Matter again. But then again, on the other side of it, it's like the whole point of the protest, the whole point of the disruption of these kind of demonstrations is to shake up what we call our normal. Like, we talk about this new normal because of the coronavirus, but I think the new normal also comes to the conversations that we should have been having about race. And I think when you disrupt anything that people are comfortable with, that's when you're either forcing them to grow, or, well, it should force people to grow, but sometimes it could force them to just be upset about the situation. So I think, to Michaela's point, there are definitely two sides of it, but I do think that there is the potential for not playing, but finding a way to substitute not playing could have a greater reach than being on the court.
So I'm sorry, Jess, before you take the question, Robyn, from the team perspective, right? Do you think if sports comes back, the team is going to get distracted from the message, or do you think that they're going to stay focused on it while they're playing?
When you say team, are you saying people that work for the organization, or the players specifically? Because I know me, I won't let it go to the wayside at all, because of how important it is to me. And even now, with all of the content that we are creating, we are very sensitive about what we're putting out at this exact time. Like, when is the right time to post something about back to basketball, as opposed to what's going on at the moment, just so that we don't seem insensitive or like we don't understand what is going on. And our players are always at the forefront, especially Jalen. He is incredible when it comes to this type of thing. He's going to have an incredible career once he is done with basketball, whatever that may be. I don't think he's going to let it go by the wayside, even if he does go back and play next month, and whatever happens with that, I think it's still going to be at the forefront of his mind, that you're never going to forget about it, because it's who you are.
When there is, a video of somebody speaking instead of just a written, I've found it a lot more impactful. And I think that I'm believing more about what they are telling me they believe in, instead of just something written on paper. But I'm sure it's hard. I can't imagine being in that position to be the person to hit send or push, because you have a lot of responsibility there. And I think you have to take it by the reins and really push the message that you think is right.
But that's interesting because from a PR perspective, right? We're always thinking about like our client, us. And it's interesting to get it from all of you guys' perspective, because that means that you're getting these statements that we put. And it sounds like what we, you know, sometimes as publicists think, oh yeah, this is like the greatest thing I've ever written. Like they're all going to eat it up. It sounds like you guys are now kind of being able to like sift through the crap and sift through the bullshit. And, you know, like now, believe me, I'm going to read things like a thought. I'm probably none of you are ever going to get a pitch from me again, because I'm scared to death. But let's go over it. We'll go. Oh, go ahead, Court.
I was just going to say, I've found that the shorter the statements have been more impactful. And I don't know if that's just me, but when I see something that's, you know, paragraph on paragraph on paragraph, I'm like, this isn't one message being sent. This is a million messages being put into a cookie cutter release.
I think it's with a great platform, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think it's important to use your platform even when we're not in a time of crisis. And I think, I mean, with the Patriots and many athletes in general, they've been able to do that, not even when we're in crisis. You look at Jason and Devin McCourty, they're a perfect example of this. They've been fighting for social justice in the community. And, you know, before any of this was really at the forefront of the general public's mind, like it is right now. And so I just think that, you know, the whole narrative of sticking to sports is so irrelevant, and it's just so much more important than ever for athletes to use their platform to speak out about what's important to them, because you look at how many people look up to these people. Just think about the power they have to influence, you know, just influence people's lives when something like this isn't the topic of discussion. You can just, I just can't even imagine the impact that they can have when you look at like someone like what Jaylen Brown is doing right now. I think the impact that they can have is tremendous, and they have to use their platform, or it's a waste of, you know, the power that they have.
I can't speak for everyone because I don't know all of them personally. Right. The only ones that I won't even say speak for, but like speak to, are the ones that did get involved, just because of how important it is to them and how much it directly impacts them. I don't know anyone's reason, whether it be a player, people on this call, people in the world in general, what their reasons are behind going out and feeling like they have to use their voice versus not using their voice. But I'm sure everyone has their reason for why they may be nervous or feel like it is their responsibility to do so, but have no clue behind their process or thought process when it comes to being on the front line. So can't speak to that part directly.
I mean, I think from the Celtics perspective too, like it's very clear the ones that, you know, that are very, very active, which is a good lead over to Nora, because the NFL now, you've got players that feel that they have a responsibility to speak out, but it's coming out muddled and wrong, and it's almost doing more good, right?
Well, should we talk about Drew Brees for a second? Like that, I think. Okay, so I have complicated feelings about people's, and specifically celebrities and athletes' personal responsibilities in these situations, because I think pretty strongly, and I think this is probably obvious to all of us, as human beings, we all have a responsibility if we know that people are getting killed in the street to do something instead of doing nothing. Like that seems pretty easy to me. I have questions about the way that we prioritize the actions and the opinions of celebrities relative to, I would love to live in a world where experts, people who have devoted their lives, activists to these subjects, are the voices that are elevated. But I think realistically, the way that things are now, we need people who already have the platform and already have the attention and have the fans and the followers to just merge themselves with those people so that, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. So yeah, when that's happening, and when you have a lot of attention on people who are not necessarily educated in the way that people who have devoted their entire lives to activism or social justice or racial justice have been, people screw up. And sometimes that's because they're not as educated as they should be. Sometimes it's because there's a little bit of malice there. And I think one thing that's happening to all of us is that our BS meters are getting tuned super, super, super finely. And my experience with following the Drew Brees stuff was, he comes out and says something that I think frankly is stupid, and that when you've had 4 years just to get to a point where you can understand something that was already stated incredibly clearly for you, I didn't have a lot of sympathy for the initial, oh, I screwed up, I'm sorry if I offended people. But then, not that long after that, he has conversations with his teammates, and when his behavior is called into question by the President of the United States, he becomes an active participant in responding to that and elevating a better educated message. And it's an individual thing. Everyone's going to have a different reaction to it. I will tell you guys that my threshold was that when he did that, I kind of looked at it and said, you might have learned something, and that takes some guts. And if I were Drew Brees' teammate, that would be more meaningful to me than an initial statement saying, oh, well, if I happened to offend anybody, I'm sorry. Everybody's got to make their choices as far as what's important to them and what, you know, actually rings true to them. I will say, since we've talked a little bit about how to do the communications element of it, I think that's what's been meaningful to me, is just the ability to feel like, okay, we live in a strategic communications world. You have to worry about how you're branding yourself and how you're promoting yourself and all of that. That's fine. But it better be tied to something real, because there's real stuff that needs to be done right now and people are watching. And if it's not from the heart, just get out of the way. And I think that's sort of what the last few weeks have been pretty effective in doing, is just people have no time for the BS and are getting pretty good at calling it out when it's there.
Are you seeing that too, Nicole? Are you getting a lot of like bullshit statements from like, or athletes coming forward that you're like, you're just doing this just to kind of get like...
Going off of like Nora's BS meter, my natural reaction might have been in the past like, oh, I'm pretty skeptical of this, but I think we have to recognize that there are people that are going to have to show signs of growth. And for example, Drew Brees was late to the movement, but Devin McCourty sort of said like, it's easy to harbor some resentment, like, oh, how could you have not realized this 4 years ago? We've tried to explain our message so many times, like, how is it taking you this long to understand why we're kneeling? And so it's easy to be sort of hurt by that, but as Devin said, like, you sort of just have to push that aside and just welcome them to the movement. And the more people that come around, the better, whether that takes them like 4 years or whether they've been there all along. And so I think now we're also reaching a point where, okay, you can issue as many statements as you like, but it's time to like put your money where your mouth is, sort of like what the Crafts are doing with their donations. And I think it was really cool for them to choose Boston Uncornered, which is something that Devin McCourty has worked really closely and worked really hard on. So that sort of shows like we're listening and we care. And not only are they making those donations, but they're also having like executives of grassroots organizations like dedicated to fighting systemic racism speak at events and things like that, to bring in those experts and people that are educated and that have been working to fight against racial injustice for a long time. So I think it's now more about action. Like everyone is capable of like releasing a statement with the help of a PR team. So it's like, okay, now what actually are you going to do?
Yeah, I'm never writing a statement again. So interesting, flip side, Michaela, right? So you have kind of the opposite. Again, I don't mean to like corner you into the UFC realm, but John Jones didn't say a word. I mean, he didn't say anything. In fact, you know, he's been all over the press because he's been ranting and raving about money, right? Money, money, money. So everybody's been shitting on John Jones and being like, oh, he's such a jerk. And then he says nothing about, you know, any of the riots, but is going out and taking, you know, paint cans away from people and telling kids to calm down and telling them to find a better way and telling them not to destroy the city. Do you think that possibly knocked a few bad jujus like points off of him by not making a statement, but then just by going out there and like Nicole just said, like putting money where your mouth is, going out and actually trying to do good without saying a word about it?
Yeah, I know I personally gained a lot of respect for him in following what he did in the past couple weeks, just because I don't think that there was BS to it. It wasn't just a statement. It wasn't just, I'm going to write something on Instagram and go about my day. It was actually, he made a concerted effort to gather a group of people. He gave this speech, which was on his Instagram story, where he explained what they were going to do exactly. And to me, it came across as very genuine. And then there was video of him out doing it. And I do believe it was more than just PR stunt. Yes, everything nowadays is going to be, there's going to be pictures, there's going to be video of it, but he was actually taking those actions. He led a prayer circle between himself and his group and a bunch of law enforcement officers. And this is a guy who's had a lot of experience with law enforcement. He's been arrested several times. And I think just him going out there, and as you mentioned, there was a video of him taking away a spray paint can from a kid that is out there detracting from the actual message that's being put out. So he's out there doing good in his community and stopping the people that were distracting from this, the people that are trying to send a very important message right now. And I think that that's really important. And I mean, the first quote that came to my mind, you know, Meredith said it, is that with great power comes great responsibility. So I do think that just as a person, yeah, and especially when you have the platform that we do, that there is a great responsibility on athletes' parts. And I completely agree with what Nora said. In a perfect world, it would be great if everyone was listening to experts that are educated, highly educated on certain topics, but it isn't the reality we live in. People with platforms do get a lot of eyes, especially with younger generations who are very important for our future right now. Like if you have an athlete saying something, a teenage kid is probably a lot more likely to be like, well, that's cool because the guy that I think is cool is saying it. And I think it's an interesting example to look back at Michael Jordan, who has been criticized for not doing enough and being so laser focused on basketball, and being criticized for opportunities where he potentially could have made a difference and didn't. And had a famous quote about certain political parties buying sneakers. I have to wonder like what he thinks when he looks back and wonders what kind of change could he maybe have brought about, because he was such an influential athlete. So I think that it's interesting now just to, I mean, I know he's put out a couple of statements and donated a great deal of money. I think it was $100 million over the next 10 years, which is great now to be taking that action. I just think it's an interesting case to kind of look back on and compare it to the likes of Jaylen Brown, who is out doing it. Like, what if Michael Jordan had been out doing it a long time ago and influencing people?
The backlash back when Jordan and I were in our prime, which feels like yesterday for me, probably feels like yesterday for him, his prime was a lot better than mine. I didn't really do much. But we were not welcomed to speak out. You didn't do those things. So it's going to be interesting going forward, and we'll start, and you know what, we won't even go in order. So anybody can jump in at this point. Let's just have a discussion because I've kept you guys long enough. But do you think that now the teams, the owners, fellow teammates, more people are coming together and coming to this kind of enlightened thought? Like, do you think more athletes, teams, players, owners will be more, supportive in causes and movements? And do you think it's going to change for the better?
I think it's action. What are you going to go out in the community and do? How are you going to help and change the populations that were affected? That's why, no offense to Jordan, when that whole $100 million situation came about, it's like, you're going to make that off your one shoe you release next month or in the next 2 months. Like, that's nothing to you. That's chump change. That's like me tossing out $10, $15 to a GoFundMe. It's what impact or what is that really doing for the greater cause and the greater good? Financially, no. I think people need to get out like Jalen is doing. He has tons of money too, but you see he's on the front line. He's doing actual work and putting himself out there to make that change and make it be known. But financially, yes, I think everyone's going to do that. All of the companies, they're going to put out all of these statements. They're going to give us Juneteenth off to say that they did it. But ultimately after that, what are they going to do?
Do you think athletes are going to be stronger to step up? Oh, sorry, Kwani, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree with Robyn 100%. And I think, not to attack PR, but it's a lot of times it's feeling like it's going to be a PR move. Like, everyone wants to be in the right now because they realize the financial risks of it. But when we see sustainable action and like real concrete evidence that this company cares, that's the only way that we'll know it's genuine. Because at the end of the day, you don't get canceled like Drew Brees almost did. So you're going to say the right things. You're going to consult the right people so that you don't have this PR disaster. But when we see actual action, that's when we'll know these companies or these entities are actually genuine in their intentions.
So I think we have to understand that a lot of these institutions are lowercase c conservative in the sense that they have done very well in a status quo environment and are therefore resistant to change just on a reflexive level. So it takes a lot of active measures to educate. And I think a big part of that is promoting voices, on social media, but also in the upper echelons of corporations and of all of these leagues that have diverse experiences and that understand these issues personally, because they're the ones who are going to be the leaders. We all have to work really, really, really hard to support them, but it can't just be this top-down thing where when a league or a team or whoever is comfortable with it, they will elevate, their employees. At a certain point, I think the most effective thing will be if we empower people who care about this in a lived, authentic way to be the people making change. And I tend to be a happy, shiny person, but I'm a little skeptical about how far we'll go until we do that. But I also think the thing that we have to recognize is that sometimes the past seems a lot further away than it actually is. Like, in a lot of our textbooks growing up, we learned about the civil rights movement and we saw black and white photos of Ruby Bridges or whoever, and those photos were taken in color. It wasn't that long ago. Mm-hmm. But a lot of these images have been presented to us in a way that makes us feel like, oh, well, that's not my lifetime, and it wasn't my parents' lifetime, and it was a really, really, really long time ago, and it's almost academic at this point. And that's not true. We didn't live in a country where the majority of people thought that interracial couples were okay until the 90s. Like, that's our childhood. So it is, I guess, unrealistic to expect just like perfect forward progress. I don't think that we're going to get it, but I think that if we are learning the lesson through this, that players have more power than maybe they previously realized they did. They can push these teams in these leagues because they're nothing without them.
It's true. It's true. And I hope that more teams, you know, we interviewed Martellus Bennett. Martellus Bennett came and spoke to my class at Suffolk, and I went back and I watched our conversation again recently, and he was recently in an article because he was saying, like, stick up for your teammates. Teams need to come together. So I hope that there is a change where at least these teams kind of do band together and they have a more powerful unit if these team members are stepping up for each other and supporting each other, because that's what Marty was saying. He was saying, you know, don't just say it, actually be there and support us in our fight. Whatever our fights are, we need to support each other. We're a team. That's, you know, that's the case. So I hope, you know, I hope that does change. I've kept you girls long enough. Jess and I have, but and you can shout it out. Who's everybody's favorite, most inspirational, like, athlete at this time or at any time? Like, what's your most inspiring moment that you can remember an athlete just absolutely getting you right in the heart and being like, yes, I love you. I feel better. I feel strong. I feel powerful.
I think, I mean, we've all said Jaylen Brown's name a million times. I think right now he is hands down probably the most influential, most unbelievable athlete I've watched during this time. I also think JJ Watt has been pretty incredible. And I also think Aaron Baines, his Instagram post, I going back to what Nora said about interracial relationships, I didn't know that he had a Black wife. And I mean, the fact that he actually had to do a whole post about it was wild. And I thought everything he said was important. And I thought that it was something that I didn't necessarily expect Aaron Baines to be somebody that I would be saying was impactful during this time. But I was blown away. I thought what he had to say was really spot on.
I think Enes Kanter, he's been fighting for social justice way before this, which I know Jaylen Brown has as well, and a lot of other athletes that we've already mentioned. I just think sometimes, whether it be that he's like a slightly lesser known name than like the LeBron Jameses of the world, but he's always out there trying to get his message across, and I find him inspiring.
I've honestly just been inspired watching old Colin Kaepernick media availability and his message. It's very inspiring to hear what he was saying and to sort of see what he was doing at the time, but it's also really sad that nobody really listened to him, and like we're still in the exact same place and we're still preaching the exact same messages as he was at that time. So it's just been like an interesting learning experience sort of watching that back then and sort of finding that everything he's saying still holds true today and just how little progress that we've made. So he's just been obviously a central figure to all of this, but just listening to him at the time has been, I think, like a really inspiring experience for me.
My answer is actually just, they're actually players of the era before us, but the main one I think would be Muhammad Ali and the other athletes of the 60s, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and like athletes like that, because I think they're the ones who kind of set the standard for what activism looks like, especially for Black athletes. I don't think without a Muhammad Ali, you would have a Colin Kaepernick. Not to say that Colin wouldn't have done what he did, but I think you always do need to be able to look to the people before you and see how they were able to maneuver through history. And obviously we're at a point where it feels like history is repeating itself, but I think that the players of present are kind of shadowing that in a way that's, I think, more impactful. But just to see what Muhammad Ali was able to do as one of the best athletes of his time, and to really just be unapologetic about what he was fighting for. I think that is just so valuable to the movement now, because obviously progress has been made, but clearly it hasn't been enough. But to know that there were people that fought before us to even get us to where we are, I'm inspired by them, but also inspired the Enes Kanters, the Jaylen Browns, the Colin Kaepernicks as well, because without the Alis, we wouldn't have the Browns. And I think with all of them together, I think that's how we actually get the collective change that we're looking for.
I agree. Someone that you all didn't bring up, LeBron. I know people tend to have issues with him, but he is out doing things. Schools, being active, using his voice and his platform. He's probably, I think, the most influential right now, just his reach and what he's able to do holistically. So definitely have to toss him in there, not just racial injustice and everything that's going on, but what he's been doing even leading up to this with giving back, creating opportunities, creating those safe spaces in schools. He's really like putting his money where his mouth is.
I will shout out the McCourties. You know, I think they really, to me, symbolize what we've touched on a little bit, where they're effective communicators. Like, I think they know how to use PR and work with all of these essential things in a way that's really smart and really good, but they have a track record where you just know that it's authentic. You know that it's lived and felt, and something where they've put their money, their time, their attention, their thought, just all of it into these causes for a long time. And I think just really set a standard we can all aspire to, especially, you know, I think Devin's family is dealing with a personal tragedy, his wife losing a pregnancy, and to see them still out there and doing everything that they possibly can. I really admire it. You know, I've worked around Devin for longer than Jason, but I would say that those two are people I feel very lucky to have covered, and just to have been able to witness live their lives in the way that they do and use their platforms as they do. So shout out to both of those guys.
I appreciate all of you very much. I wish we could have our Bombshells event and get together and have a drink and a hug. And thank you, ladies. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful rest of the week. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.